The January wind carved through Chicago streets like a blade made of frozen disappointment, turning every breath into visible surrender. Leopold Varlada's hand enclosed his son's smaller fingers as they emerged from the Millennium Convention Center, where 2 hours of champagne philanthropy had finally released them back into honest cold. Behind the glass doors, men in tailored suits continued negotiations that would never appear in legitimate ledgers. Milo's patent leather shoes clicked in impatient rhythm against concrete that had witnessed 1,000 similar exits, his small body restless after enforced stillness among adults who spoke in careful codes. The boy had earned whispered praise for his manners, collecting approving nods from women whose jewelry cost more than most families earned in years. Their car waited 3 blocks distant where the driver had been forced to park. The beggar existed in the recessed doorway of a shuttered coffee shop, like furniture that had always been there, her presence so thoroughly absorbed into the urban landscape that she'd achieved invisibility through sheer persistence. Her coat hung in folds that spoke of different owners, fraying where fabric met the constant friction of survival. Canvas bag slumped beside her feet with the defeated posture of objects that had traveled too far without arriving anywhere worth reaching. Golden hair emerged from beneath grime in strands that caught streetlight with stubborn refusal to completely surrender beauty. Leopold's gaze swept past her with the efficiency of someone trained to categorize and dismiss in the same motion, his attention already calculating traffic patterns at the intersection ahead. The city manufactured her type by the thousands, casualties of systems that processed human beings into statistical casualties. Inside the gala, he'd written a check that would fund literacy programs for disadvantaged children, which satisfied whatever accounting his conscience still maintained. The mathematics had long been settled into compartments that didn't communicate with each other. His capacity for individual response had been carefully excised by years of necessary emotional triage, the survival mechanism of someone whose work required choosing which suffering to acknowledge and which to ignore. But Milo stopped with such violence that Leopold's shoulder jerked backward, the child's hand transforming from warm weight into rigid anchor. The boy's entire body had reoriented toward the beggar, with the mechanical certainty of iron filings finding magnetic north. His forward momentum arrested so completely that physics seemed briefly negotiable. His small face tilted upward toward the woman with an intensity that belonged to much older recognition. The streetlight flickered once, creating a moment where shadows rearranged themselves into patterns that Leopold's hindbrain recognized before his conscious mind could construct defenses. The beggar's face, stripped of context and expectation, held architecture that his hands had once traced in darkness between silk sheets. Her eyes lifted briefly toward their passing footsteps, carrying a specific shade of gray-blue that existed nowhere else in Leopold's catalog of remembered details. Milo's finger rose to point with the unwavering certainty of someone who'd just spotted true north on a compass that everyone else insisted was broken. "Dad," the child said, his voice threading through winter air with the clear pitch of absolute conviction unmarred by doubt. "That's Mom." The declaration carried no questioning inflection, no appeal for adult confirmation, just simple statement of truth that the boy's heart had identified. Leopold's breath caught somewhere in his chest and refused to complete its journey, creating pressure that mimicked cardiac failure, but was only the body's revolt against impossible information. His first response was reflexive dismissal, the automatic protection that any rational mind deploys when presented with evidence that threatens to demolish carefully reconstructed life. Amber had been declared legally dead 18 months after disappearing, her memorial service attended by 200 people. The beggar turned her face fully toward them in response to the child's voice, and streetlight collaboration revealed features that deprivation and exposure had carved into something almost unrecognizable. Leopold's training in reading faces, in detecting deception through micro-expressions, confirmed what his heart was still desperately denying. The bone structure remained despite hollowed cheeks, the specific angle of her jaw unchanged by whatever had stolen everything else, including apparently her memory. Her lips moved soundlessly at first, then shaped words that emerged as fragments of melody rather than speech, a lullaby that Amber had sung to Milo every night before sleep claimed him. The tune of "Hush Little Baby" drifted through frozen air with the quality of something emerging from deep underwater, barely recognizable but undeniably present. Milo's small body relaxed fractionally in response to the melody, his recognition confirmed by this final piece of evidence that transcended visual identification. 3 years of carefully maintained mourning collapsed into rubble in the space between heartbeats. Every assumption about what had happened to his wife suddenly revealed as fiction built on incomplete investigation. Amber hadn't died in whatever tragedy he'd imagined had claimed her. She'd survived and somehow descended into this unthinkable existence, while he'd buried an empty casket. The guilt arrived with the weight of continental plates shifting, grinding against each other with force that threatened to crack his carefully maintained composure. The woman clutched her canvas bag tighter and began to rise, her movements telegraphing flight rather than approach, instincts honed by streets where attention meant danger more reliably than salvation. She backed toward deeper shadows of the doorway, her eyes darting between Leopold's face and the child who continued pointing with innocent insistence. Whatever had transformed Amber Varlotta into this frightened creature had apparently included stealing every memory of the life she'd lived before. "Wait," Leopold heard himself say, the word emerging with more command than he'd intended, carrying unconscious authority that made the woman flinch visibly. She shrank further into darkness, and he realized with sickening clarity that she didn't know him, that her face held no spark of recognition, only the wary confusion of someone accustomed to being invisible, suddenly finding herself observed, registered in her expression, along with the calculating assessment of whether this attention represented threat. Milo pulled free from his father's grip and took 3 steps toward the woman, before Leopold's reflexes could intervene. The child's face tilted upward with hope that hadn't yet learned the vocabulary of disappointment. "Mom, it's me. It's Milo," the boy said, his voice carrying patient explanation of someone speaking to an adult who'd momentarily forgotten something obvious. "Remember? You used to make pancakes on Saturday and we'd watch cartoons together." The beggar stared at the child with an expression that cycled through confusion, fear, and something deeper that Leopold recognized as the pain of reaching for memories that refused to surface. Her hand lifted slightly, fingers extending toward Milo's face before stopping in midair, trembling with the effort of some internal battle. "I don't," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse and winter cold, shaped by an accent that had been smoothed away during her previous life. "I don't remember anything before the bus station," she continued, the admission emerging with the defeated quality of someone who'd made this confession many times before without finding resolution. Her eyes held the frustration of someone repeatedly hitting the same wall of missing information, searching for doors that should exist, but remained stubbornly absent. The trembling in her extended hand intensified before she withdrew it completely, tucking both hands into her coat pockets, as if punishing them for reaching toward connection they had no right to claim. Milo reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph that Leopold hadn't known the child carried, its edges worn from frequent handling, and its surface creased from being folded and unfolded countless times. The boy held it up toward the beggar with both hands, an offering and an appeal, and a piece of evidence all compressed into one laminated rectangle. "This is you," Milo said simply, his voice holding absolute faith that showing her face would restore everything that had been lost. The photograph trembled in Milo's small hands, its surface catching the streetlight in a way that made the image seem to glow against the surrounding darkness. Amber's eyes fixed on the rectangle with an intensity that suggested drowning person spotting potential rescue, her entire body going rigid as her brain attempted to process information. The image showed a woman with clean blonde hair laughing at the camera, while a smaller version of the boy before her sat on her lap. Leopold watched his wife's face as she stared at the photograph, tracking the micro-expressions that flickered across features he'd once known as intimately as his own reflection. Her pupils dilated slightly, the involuntary physical response to recognition operating on a level deeper than conscious memory could access or deny. Her breathing changed rhythm, becoming shallow and rapid, the pattern of someone experiencing shock without understanding its source, her hand rising unconsciously to touch her own face. "I found this in a dumpster behind the library 18 months ago, Amber whispered, her voice carrying the fragmented quality of someone reporting facts without connecting them to personal narrative. It was in a purse with other things, but the photograph was the only thing that survived the water damage. She pulled her canvas bag closer and extracted a Ziploc plastic bag, inside which the photograph's twin rested alongside other water-stained documents too damaged to read. "I've been carrying it because I thought maybe someone would recognize the woman and tell me where to find her," she continued, her words revealing that Amber had been searching for herself without knowing that was the nature of her quest. "Tell me who she was, so I could return her picture." The statement landed with devastating innocence, carrying evidence of her own identity like a detective pursuing a missing person who existed only in mirrors, never understanding that the woman she sought looked back at her from every reflective surface. Leopold's mind raced through implications, constructing and discarding theories about what could cause a person to forget themselves so completely while retaining enough function to survive. Trauma-induced amnesia existed in medical literature, but usually resolved within days or weeks, not years. This was something more profound, a psychological break so complete that Amber had constructed an entirely new identity from nothing, her mind protecting itself from unbearable truth by simply erasing the existence of that truth. "The bus station?" Leopold asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the chaos of emotions threatening to break through professional composure. "Which bus station? And when, exactly?" The question emerged from the part of his mind trained to gather intelligence, to construct timelines and establish facts even when those facts threatened to demolish everything he thought he understood. His son stood between them now, a small bridge connecting two shores that should have never been separated by anything except normal distance. Amber's eyes clouded with the frustration of someone repeatedly hitting the same wall of missing information, her hands clenching and unclenching as if physical movement could shake loose memories. "The Greyhound terminal on Harrison Street," she said slowly, each word extracted with visible effort. "I woke up on a bench outside the building just before dawn, and when I tried to remember how I got there or where I was supposed to go, there was nothing." She touched her temple where a faint scar curved along her hairline. The timeline clicked into place in Leopold's mind with the precision of tumblers falling in a lock, because Harrison Street Terminal was where Amber had been headed the night she disappeared. They'd argued that evening about his business, about the increasing danger she perceived in the associations he maintained, about whether their son was being raised in an environment compatible with normal childhood development. She'd thrown clothes into an overnight bag with angry efficiency and announced she needed space to think. He'd let her go, confident that distance would provide perspective, and she'd return within a week with renewed appreciation for the security his position provided. Instead, she'd vanished somewhere between their Lincoln Park brownstone and the bus terminal 6 miles south, her phone going dead around midnight and never transmitting signal again. The police investigation had been thorough but fruitless, finding no evidence of foul play, and eventually concluding she'd chosen to disappear voluntarily, a narrative Leopold had rejected until absence of alternatives forced acceptance. "You never made it onto the bus," Leopold said, speaking more to himself than to Amber as pieces of a 3-year puzzle finally began assembling into coherent picture. "Something happened between our house and the terminal. Something that left you with that scar and stole your memory of everything that came before." The scenarios his mind generated were uniformly dark, involving the various enemies his position had accumulated, the rival organizations who'd see value in targeting a wife as leverage. Amber's hand moved to the scar again, tracing its path with fingers that suggested this was habitual gesture, performed countless times without yielding answers. "The doctors at the free clinic said it was old wound, probably 9 or 10 months healed by the time I finally went in for the headaches," she offered, her voice carrying the detached quality of someone reporting on a stranger's medical history, rather than personal experience, the emotional distance necessary to discuss trauma without being consumed by its weight. The casual mention of free clinics and lack of insurance created a fresh wave of rage in Leopold's chest, fury directed at himself for failing to find her, at the systems that allowed citizens to fall through cracks so completely they ceased to exist in official records, at whatever forces had reduced his wife to this state of abandonment. His hands formed fists inside his coat pockets, where Milo couldn't see the physical manifestation of emotions he'd learned to control in all other circumstances, but which now threatened to break through carefully maintained professional detachment. "You're Amber Varlotta," Leopold said, each word weighted with certainty, despite knowing that simply stating fact wouldn't restore what had been lost. "You're my wife, you're Milo's mother, and 3 years ago, you were heading to catch a bus when something happened that I'm going to find out about." The promise emerged before calculation could temper it, the vow of someone whose power had failed to protect what mattered most, but might still serve to uncover truth and extract whatever justice remained possible. Amber's face cycled through expressions too rapid to catalog individually, settling finally on a careful blankness that Leopold recognized as defensive mechanism against information too overwhelming to process. She took a step backward, her body language screaming flight response, even as her eyes remained locked on Milo's face with hunger that transcended conscious understanding. "I don't know you," she whispered, but the protestation carried less conviction than before, her voice betraying the uncertainty of someone whose entire reality had just been called into question. Milo moved closer to his mother with the fearless directness of childhood, closing the distance she'd tried to create until he stood within arm's reach of her torn coat. "You used to sing to me every night before bed," the boy said with perfect confidence, his small face tilted upward to meet her eyes. "The song about the mockingbird and the diamond ring. And when you got to the part about the looking glass, you'd always make a funny face." He demonstrated the expression, his features contorting into exaggerated surprise. Something shifted behind Amber's eyes, a flicker of response that suggested muscle memory, recognizing pattern, even when conscious mind drew blanks. Her mouth softened almost imperceptibly, and her hand rose again, this time completing the journey to touch Milo's cheek with a gentleness that contradicted the rough appearance of her fingers. The contact lasted only seconds before she snatched her hand back as if burned, but in those seconds, Leopold saw his wife surface briefly from beneath the layers of trauma. "I sing that song sometimes," Amber admitted quietly, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of distant traffic and wind whistling through empty spaces between buildings. "I don't know where I learned it or why it feels important, but when I can't sleep I hum it to myself, and it makes the night less frightening." The confession revealed glimpses of the isolation she'd endured, nights spent finding comfort in melodies whose origins she couldn't trace, but which connected her to a past that existed only as emotional residue. Leopold's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, the vibration pattern indicating his driver wondering about the delay and whether situation required intervention. He ignored it completely, his entire focus narrowed to the woman before him and the child between them, the three of them forming a tableau that should have been impossible. The gala, the business obligations waiting in tomorrow's schedule, the carefully constructed life he'd built in the aftermath of loss, all of it receded to irrelevance in the face of this moment. "Come with us," Leopold said, making his voice as gentle as it was capable of becoming, softening the edges of authority into something resembling request rather than command. "Let me help you. Let us figure out together what happened and how to move forward from here." The offer carried implications he wasn't ready to examine, commitments that would complicate the already Byzantine architecture of his life, but the alternative of walking away and leaving her to the streets was unthinkable now that she'd been found. Amber's eyes darted past Leopold to the street beyond, calculating distances and escape routes with the practiced assessment of someone who'd learned that survival often meant rapid departure from situations that felt threatening. "I don't know you," she repeated, but this time the statement sounded less like rejection and more like mourning for the knowledge that should have been present, but wasn't. "How can I trust someone I don't remember? Go somewhere with a stranger who claims to be my husband?" The question hung between them while Leopold searched for an answer that would satisfy reasonable caution without requiring the trust that amnesia had made impossible. Forcing her would be simple, his resources more than adequate to ensure compliance, but that approach would destroy whatever fragile possibility existed for genuine restoration. She needed to choose this, needed to walk toward rather than be dragged, or the foundation would be poisoned from the beginning by coercion disguised as rescue, making any future relationship built on that foundation inherently unstable. "The Palmer House Hotel is 3 blocks from here," Leopold said finally, choosing neutral ground over the territorial implications of his own home. "They have a restaurant that stays open late, warm and public, where we can sit and talk without you needing to trust me beyond the next hour." He pulled out his wallet and extracted several $100 bills, holding them where Amber could see but not offering them directly in a way that might feel like transaction or obligation. "Whether you believe my claims or not, you're clearly in need of immediate help, and Milo won't sleep tonight if I don't at least try to ensure you're somewhere safe," Leopold continued, his voice carrying the practical reasoning that might penetrate where emotional appeals would fail. The mention of the child's well-being shifted something in Amber's expression, maternal instinct surfacing from wherever it had been buried during the years of survival that required focusing exclusively on personal preservation, her eyes moving to Milo's face and registering the way his small body trembled. 1 hour, Amber agreed finally, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone negotiating terms of temporary ceasefire rather than reunion. "In the restaurant, at a table near other people, and if anything feels wrong, I'm leaving, and you won't try to stop me." The conditions revealed the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd learned that survival required maintaining exit strategies and never allowing herself to be cornered in situations where power imbalances could be exploited, her experience on the streets having taught lessons that couldn't be unlearned, simply because circumstances had shifted. Leopold nodded acceptance of her terms, and gestured toward the direction of the hotel, allowing Amber to walk slightly ahead where she could monitor both him and potential escape routes. Milo positioned himself between them, his small hand reaching back to grasp his father's fingers, while his eyes remained locked on his mother's back, as if she might evaporate if his attention wavered. The three of them moved through the winter streets like a strange procession, the architecture of a family present, but the connections fractured into cautious proximity. The Palmer House lobby blazed with light and warmth that made Amber hesitate at the entrance, her body language suggesting someone considering whether crossing the threshold would somehow trigger alarms. The doorman registered her appearance with a flicker of distaste, before Leopold's cold stare redirected his attention to examining the middle distance with sudden fascination. Money and power conveyed certain privileges, including the ability to bring unexpected guests into spaces that might otherwise question their presence, and Leopold had accumulated enough of both to make his wishes function as local law. The restaurant hostess approached with a professional smile that wavered slightly upon seeing Amber's condition, but recovered admirably when Leopold requested a corner booth away from other diners. They were seated within minutes at a location that offered privacy while maintaining visibility of exits, exactly the configuration Amber's body language indicated she required to maintain the fragile agreement to stay. The leather booth, the white tablecloths, the subtle jazz playing through invisible speakers. All of it represented a world Amber had been exiled from so completely. Leopold ordered coffee and a full dinner service without consulting menus, his choices based on memory of what Amber had favored during their marriage, combined with practical awareness that someone experiencing sustained hunger needed careful reintroduction. The waiter departed with discretion that came from years of serving clientele, whose privacy was more valuable than curiosity. Milo climbed onto the booth beside his mother, maintaining careful distance that respected her obvious discomfort with proximity, while positioning himself close enough that she couldn't leave without him noticing immediately. "The scar on your temple," Leopold began once they were alone, his voice low enough that surrounding tables couldn't intercept the conversation. "Do you remember anything about how you got it? Even fragments or impressions that don't form complete narrative?" He was careful to frame the question as request rather than interrogation, aware that Amber's cooperation was voluntary and could be revoked at any moment if she felt pressured or threatened by the intensity of his need to understand what had happened to transform his wife into this frightened stranger. Amber's fingers traced the scar again, the gesture apparently unconscious, her eyes losing focus as she attempted to access memories that remained stubbornly absent, despite the significance others ascribed to them. "Sometimes I dream about headlights," she said slowly, each word extracted with visible effort from whatever vault her trauma had locked them behind. "Bright lights coming toward me and the sound of metal screaming. But I don't know if that's actual memory or just my brain constructing explanations for waking up with gaps where identity should be." The coffee arrived, and Amber wrapped both hands around the cup with reverence that suggested this simple warmth represented luxury beyond measure, the heat seeping into fingers that bore evidence of countless nights spent fighting cold. She didn't drink immediately, just held the warmth and allowed her eyes to close briefly in something that resembled prayer or meditation. When they opened again, tears tracked through the grime on her cheeks, though whether from the physical relief of warmth or emotional overwhelm remained unclear even to her, based on the confusion that flickered across her features. "I hired 3 private investigation firms after you disappeared," Leopold said, the admission emerging, despite his usual reluctance to reveal the depths of his emotional investment in anything. "They searched for 18 months before concluding you'd either left the country deliberately or met with foul play that left no recoverable evidence." The memory of receiving their final reports, the carefully worded conclusions that added up to complete failure, still carried the weight of personal defeat that his professional successes had never quite balanced or made less heavy. Amber studied him across the table with an expression that suggested she was attempting to reconcile his claims with the stranger's face before her, looking for evidence of connection that her amnesia had stolen. "You said we were married," she ventured carefully, the statement positioned somewhere between question and test of information she couldn't verify through internal knowing. What kind of man was I married to? What kind of life did we have that ended with me not remembering any of it? Leopold felt Milo's attention sharpen, the child's awareness that his father's answer would shape how this night progressed, written clearly in the way the boy held perfectly still. The urge to construct comfortable fiction warred with the knowledge that Amber would eventually uncover whatever realities he attempted to obscure, and building trust on foundation of lies would only guarantee future collapse. His work existed in moral gray zones that most citizens preferred not to examine, providing services and maintaining order through methods that existed outside official legal frameworks, while serving functions those same structures couldn't address. "I'm not a good man by conventional definitions," Leopold said finally, choosing honesty over the easier path of palatable half-truths. "My business operates in spaces where law and necessity don't always align perfectly, providing security and solving problems for people who can't rely on official channels." The explanation was sanitized but fundamentally accurate, acknowledging the nature of his work, without dwelling on specifics that would serve no purpose beyond satisfying morbid curiosity or creating unnecessary fear about what kind of world she'd been part of before. "You knew what I did when we married, and for 5 years you made peace with it because I kept that world away from our home and from Milo," Leopold continued, his voice carrying the weight of history that Amber couldn't access, but which shaped the current moment nonetheless. "Until the night you disappeared, when you decided that peace wasn't sustainable anymore, that the compromise you'd made was costing more than you were willing to continue paying, and you needed distance to figure out whether staying was possible or whether protecting Milo required leaving permanently." Amber's expression shifted into something harder to read, processing information that should have triggered recognition, but instead landed as abstract knowledge about a stranger's life choices. "And the night I disappeared," she said slowly, pieces of puzzle assembling themselves even without memory to guide the process. "We argued about this business of yours, about whether it was compatible with raising a child, and I left angry, which is why you didn't immediately report me missing when I didn't come home, because you thought I'd chosen to leave rather than something having happened, to prevent my return." The food arrived in covered dishes that the waiter arranged with practiced efficiency before departing, the steam rising from hot meals creating temporary clouds above the table that dissipated quickly. Amber stared at the plates with an expression that cycled through hunger, suspicion, and something that resembled grief for the casual relationship with abundance she no longer possessed. Her hands moved toward the food, then hesitated, caught between need and strange paralysis. "Eat," Leopold said gently, recognizing the psychological barrier that poverty and trauma had constructed, even around something as fundamental as accepting offered sustenance. "Nothing is contingent on anything else. Regardless of what you decide after tonight, you're not obligated to me for a meal." The clarification seemed to release whatever hold had frozen her, and Amber began eating with the careful control of someone who'd learned that consuming too quickly after sustained hunger caused physical pain. Milo picked at his own food while watching his mother with the focused attention of someone memorizing details for later examination, the child's sharp intelligence evident in how he cataloged her mannerisms. "You used to cut your food the same way," the boy observed quietly, his voice carrying wonder at discovering continuity beneath the surface changes. "Small pieces, always the same size, and you'd arrange them on the plate before starting to eat." The detail was so specific that Amber's hand stopped mid-motion, her eyes dropping to examine her plate where she'd unconsciously created the geometric arrangement Milo described. Something flickered across her face, recognition without context, the strange experience of discovering behavior patterns that predated conscious memory. She set down her fork and stared at the organized sections of food, as if they might contain answers to questions she didn't know how to formulate properly. "What else?" Amber asked, her voice barely above a whisper, addressing Milo rather than Leopold because the child felt safer somehow, less threatening in his innocent observations. "What else did I do? How did I move through the world before everything disappeared?" The hunger in her question had nothing to do with physical sustenance and everything to do with the desperate need to recover stolen identity, to understand who she'd been before trauma had reduced her to survival mode. Milo's face brightened with the enthusiasm of someone finally permitted to share treasure trove of carefully preserved memories that adults had discouraged him from discussing. "You always hummed when you cooked. Different songs for different foods," he said, his words tumbling out with increasing speed. "Pasta meant Italian opera, even though you didn't know the words, and breakfast was always jazz, the kind with piano that Dad said sounded like rain on windows." Leopold watched Amber's face as his son spoke, tracking the micro-movements that suggested deeper processing occurring beneath her careful stillness. Her eyes had unfocused slightly, attention turned inward as if searching databases that refused to yield their contents despite proper access codes being provided. Frustration creased her forehead when the search came up empty again, the familiar disappointment of reaching for something that should be within grasp, but remained stubbornly intangible no matter how many times the attempt was repeated. "You collected things," Leopold added, his voice joining the reconstruction carefully, offering pieces without overwhelming her with the entire picture at once. Not valuable things, just objects that caught your attention for reasons you couldn't always explain. Smooth stones from the lake, vintage buttons from thrift stores, postcards of places you'd never been. The observation seemed mundane, but it sparked something in Amber's expression, a flicker of connection to the impulse, even if the specific memories remained absent from conscious access. Amber reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a small tin that rattled when moved, opening it to reveal a collection of items that exactly matched Leopold's description. Smooth pebbles sat alongside tarnished buttons, a handful of bottle caps worn smooth by time, 3 subway tokens from a system that no longer accepted them. "I've been picking these up for months," she said, staring at the contents with new understanding. "I thought I was just being strange, hoarding trash, but maybe I was remembering something without knowing I was remembering." The revelation hung between them, evidence that identity persisted beneath conscious awareness, that the person Amber had been continued to influence the person she'd become, despite the complete break in memory. Leopold felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the despair that had accompanied the initial discovery of his wife in such diminished circumstances. If fragments of her original self remained active even through amnesia, perhaps reconstruction was possible. Perhaps the woman he'd loved hadn't been entirely erased by whatever trauma had stolen her explicit memories. "Your sister lives in Milwaukee," Leopold said, introducing new information to test how her mind responded to facts about relationships she couldn't consciously recall. "Catherine, 2 years older than you, works as a librarian, has twin daughters who just turned 6. He watched carefully for any physical response, any unconscious recognition that might manifest before conscious processing could interfere. You were going to visit her the night you disappeared. Needed space to think about whether staying in our marriage was sustainable." The name Catherine produced a visible reaction, Amber's hand moving to her chest as if responding to physical impact, her breathing becoming slightly irregular. "I dream about someone calling that name," she admitted slowly, the confession clearly costing her something to articulate. "In the dreams I'm answering, turning toward the voice, but I can never see who's speaking, or understand the context beyond the feeling that the name matters." Her eyes searched Leopold's face for confirmation, that this fragment had value, that she wasn't constructing false memories from desperate need to belong somewhere. "She's been searching for you," Leopold continued, his voice gentle with the weight of someone delivering information about love that had persisted despite absence and silence. "She files missing person reports every 3 months, keeps your case active, refuses to accept the official narrative that you chose to disappear." The knowledge that someone had maintained faith produced tears that Amber didn't attempt to conceal. The evidence that she'd been wanted, that her absence had created a void that hadn't been casually filled with acceptance, seemed to reach past her defensive barriers. Milo had finished eating, and now leaned against his mother's arm with the natural affection of someone who'd decided that uncertainty about recognition didn't preclude offering comfort. Amber stiffened initially at the contact, then gradually relaxed, her hand rising tentatively to rest on the child's head, in a gesture that looked awkward, but felt instinctively correct. The boy's eyes closed with contentment that suggested he'd been waiting 3 years for exactly this touch, this specific configuration of physical connection that marked maternal presence. "I don't know how to be a mother," Amber whispered, her voice breaking slightly on the admission, her hand continuing its gentle movement through Milo's hair despite the protestation. "I don't remember how to do any of the things that matter, don't even remember loving him, but something in me responds to his face like muscle memory that exists below conscious thought." The confession revealed the profound disorientation of experiencing instinctive connection to people who remained essentially strangers, the cognitive dissonance of feeling drawn toward relationships she had no memory of building. Leopold signaled for the check, and it appeared within seconds, the waiter's efficiency suggesting he'd been monitoring their table for exactly this cue. "There's a medical facility I work with," Leopold said as he signed the receipt, choosing his words carefully to avoid triggering Amber's flight response. "Specialists who deal with trauma-related memory loss, people who might be able to help you recover what was taken, or at least understand why it remains inaccessible." He kept his tone neutral, presenting option rather than demand, aware that Amber's cooperation couldn't be forced. "I've been to doctors," Amber said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd navigated bureaucratic systems without resources or support and found them uniformly unhelpful. Free clinics where they take one look at me and decide the problem is drugs or mental illness, where treatment means handing over pamphlets for shelters and suggesting I pray for guidance. The bitterness in her tone spoke to months or years of being dismissed, of having legitimate trauma treated as moral failing, of existing in a system that provided care based on ability to pay, rather than severity of need. "These doctors work for me," Leopold clarified, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone accustomed to having resources bend to his requirements. "They'll see you because I ask them to, and they'll provide actual care including imaging and psychological evaluation, whatever's necessary to understand what happened and what might be possible going forward." He paused, allowing her to process the implications. "The appointment can be tomorrow or next week or never, entirely your choice, but the option exists whenever you're ready to pursue it." Amber's fingers worried the edge of her canvas bag, while her mind clearly worked through calculations about accepting help that came with strings she couldn't yet identify. The restaurant had begun to empty, late diners departing into the cold night, leaving their corner booth increasingly isolated. Milo had dozed off against her arm, his small body radiating the heat and trust that only children managed, his breathing deep and regular in a way that suggested he felt safer than he had in recent memory. "Where would I stay?" Amber asked finally, the practical question revealing she was at least considering the possibility, rather than reflexively rejecting all offers. "I can't go back to the shelter tonight if I'm supposed to see doctors tomorrow. They lock the doors at 10 and don't make exceptions." Her voice carried the exhausted pragmatism of someone who'd learned that survival required understanding and working within systems, rather than fighting their arbitrary constraints, even when those constraints felt deliberately designed to make help inaccessible. Leopold had anticipated this question and prepared multiple answers, each calibrated to different levels of trust and comfort. "There's a suite in this hotel under permanent reservation for business associates who need secure lodging," he said, choosing the option that provided safety without demanding proximity. "Separate bedroom, full bathroom, room service available 24 hours, and most importantly, it's yours for as long as you need it without obligation or surveillance." He pulled a key card from his wallet and set it on the table between them. The offer hung there like something that might explode if handled incorrectly, too generous to accept without suspicion, yet desperately needed in ways that made refusal almost impossible. Amber's eyes moved from the keycard to Leopold's face and back, searching for the trap that experience insisted must be present when men offered women in vulnerable positions exactly what they needed most. "What do you want in exchange?" she asked bluntly, her directness cutting through any pretense of casual charity. Nobody gives something this valuable without expecting something back. "I want my wife's memory restored if possible," Leopold said, matching her directness with his own version of uncomfortable honesty. "I want my son to have his mother back in whatever capacity that's achievable. I want to understand what happened 3 years ago and ensure it never happens to anyone else." He held her gaze steadily, allowing her to read whatever truth she needed from his expression. "But none of those wants require anything from you right now, except agreement to be safe and warm tonight instead of sleeping in a subway station." Amber's hand moved toward the keycard, then stopped, retreated, advanced again in a pattern that revealed her internal struggle between need and learned wariness. "One night," she finally said, the agreement hedged with temporal limitation that preserved her sense of control over circumstances threatening to sweep her into currents she couldn't navigate. "Tomorrow I'll consider the doctors, but tonight is just about having a bed and a door that locks from the inside." She took the key card with movements suggesting she half expected it to be snatched away, the muscle memory of disappointment making even accepted gifts feel conditional. Leopold carefully lifted his sleeping son from the booth, the child's body remaining limp with the absolute trust that only exhausted children managed, his small arms instinctively wrapping around his father's neck. "I'll take Milo home and come back in the morning," he said, the statement carefully structured to make clear he wasn't inviting himself into Amber's space or assuming proximity. "The suite is on the 14th floor, room 1412, and the front desk has instructions to provide anything you request without question or limit." They moved through the lobby together but separately, maintaining careful distance that acknowledged the fragility of whatever agreement they'd reached over dinner. The elevator arrived and Amber stepped inside alone, her fingers white-knuckled around her canvas bag, her eyes holding mixture of hope and terror that suggested she still half expected this entire night to reveal itself as elaborate cruelty. The doors began to close, and Leopold saw her mouth form words that might have been thank you or might have been goodbye, the distinction unclear before steel separated them, and she ascended toward temporary sanctuary. The lobby felt cavernously empty after her departure, populated only by night staff who moved through their duties with the efficient invisibility of people trained not to see what guests preferred to keep private. Leopold adjusted Milo's weight against his shoulder and moved toward the exit where his driver waited, his mind already racing ahead to the dozens of calls he needed to make before sunrise. Medical specialists required activation, security personnel needed briefing, and most urgently, someone had to begin the forensic reconstruction of what had happened 3 years ago, in the hours between Amber leaving their home and waking on a bus station bench. The drive back to Lincoln Park took 20 minutes through streets now empty of everything except delivery trucks and the occasional taxi ferrying late-night workers home. Milo stirred briefly when carried inside, murmuring something about his mother that dissolved back into sleep, before forming complete sentence. Leopold laid the boy in his bed still wearing the miniature tuxedo, too exhausted himself to navigate the logistics of pajamas and teeth brushing, the night's revelations having drained reserves he hadn't known were already dangerously depleted. His own bedroom felt like a museum dedicated to a marriage that had existed in different reality, Amber's belongings still occupying their designated spaces, because he'd never possessed the emotional capacity to clear them out. Her closet held dresses she'd never wear again. Her nightstand still had the mystery novel she'd been reading with a bookmark, holding her place on page 143. The wedding photo on the dresser showed 2 people who'd believed their biggest challenges would be ordinary marital negotiation, rather than the complete dissolution of shared reality through trauma and forced forgetting. Leopold sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found Dr. Sarah Chen, the neurologist who'd consulted on other sensitive cases requiring discretion. The call went to voicemail, and he left a message that conveyed urgency without providing details, requesting an emergency consultation for early morning. Next was Marcus Webb, the security specialist who'd led the original investigation into Amber's disappearance, and who would need to know that every conclusion drawn 3 years ago now required complete re-examination in light of her survival and amnesia. Sleep felt impossible with his mind cycling through scenarios and possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. If Amber's disappearance had been deliberate attack rather than random misfortune, the perpetrators remained at large, and possibly still represented threat. If her amnesia was trauma-induced rather than organic, something horrific had happened in the hours she couldn't remember. If she'd been living on streets for 3 years while he'd moved forward with his life, the moral weight of that failure threatened to crush whatever remained of his carefully constructed self-image. The security footage from 3 years ago would need to be reviewed again with fresh eyes, now that they knew Amber had made it at least as far as the Harrison Street terminal area. Traffic cameras, business surveillance, ATM recordings, all of it existed in archives that could be accessed with appropriate pressure, applied to appropriate bureaucrats. Someone had seen something. Cameras had captured fragments of her journey. And somewhere in the accumulated digital detritus of urban life existed evidence that would explain how Amber Varlotta had vanished into thin air and re-emerged as an amnesiac beggar. His phone buzzed with Dr. Chen's return call despite the late hour, her voice alert in the way that suggested she'd been awake rather than disturbed. "I got your message," she said without preamble, her professional efficiency one of the qualities that made her valuable for situations requiring absolute discretion. "Emergency consultation for early morning. Should I clear my schedule or just move some appointments?" The question acknowledged that Leopold's emergencies typically qualified as genuine rather than exaggerated, his track record of crying wolf remaining unblemished by false alarms. "Clear the morning," Leopold said, his voice carrying the weight that made clear this wasn't negotiable request. "Trauma-induced amnesia, 3-year duration. Patient is female mid-30s who's been surviving on streets without identity or support system." He paused, deciding how much to reveal during this initial call. "The patient is my wife, who was declared dead 2 years ago after extensive investigation failed to locate her, and my son identified her tonight living as a beggar outside the convention center where I'd just attended a charity gala." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Leopold briefly wondered if the connection had dropped. But then Dr. Chen's carefully controlled breathing indicated she was processing information that qualified as extraordinary, even by the standards of someone who'd treated unusual cases. "Jesus," she said finally, the professional veneer cracking slightly to reveal human response beneath. "Okay, I'll be at the private clinic at 7 a.m. with my full team, including psychiatric specialist and trauma counselor. Bring whoever needs to be there, and we'll figure out what's possible." Morning arrived with the gray reluctance of winter dawn. light filtering through clouds that promised snow without quite delivering. Leopold had managed perhaps 90 minutes of fragmented sleep, his mind too active to surrender properly, consciousness skimming just below the surface of rest without ever fully submerging. Milo appeared in the bedroom doorway, still wearing yesterday's formal clothes now wrinkled beyond redemption, his small face carrying the cautious hope of someone afraid to ask questions whose answers might shatter fragile possibilities. "Is Mom really back?" the child asked, his voice small and uncertain in a way that broke something in Leopold's chest. "Or did I dream that she was on the street and you talked to her and she came to the hotel with us?" The question revealed that Milo had learned not to trust good fortune, that 3 years of absence had taught him that hoping too much led to disappointment too large to process. Better to maintain low expectations and be pleasantly surprised than build castles from wishful thinking. "She's really back," Leopold confirmed, rising from the bed and reaching for clothing appropriate for medical consultations rather than business negotiations. "She's at the Palmer house right now, probably sleeping in an actual bed for the first time in months or years. And this morning we're taking her to see doctors who might be able to help her remember everything she's forgotten." He knelt to his son's level, meeting the child's eyes directly. "But Milo, you need to understand that she might not ever remember being your mother, might not ever remember loving us." The boy's face crumpled slightly before reconstituting itself into determined acceptance, the expression of someone deciding that having his mother alive without memories was better than the alternative of permanent absence. "That's okay," Milo said with the careful bravery of childhood trying to be adult about devastating compromise. "She can learn to love us again, right? Even if she doesn't remember the first time, she can still decide to love us now." The hope in his voice made promises Leopold wasn't certain he could keep, guarantees about future outcomes that depended on variables beyond anyone's control. They arrived at the Palmer house at 6:30, early enough that Leopold hoped to catch Amber before anxiety could convince her to flee whatever sanctuary the hotel room represented. The front desk confirmed that room service had delivered breakfast at her request, which suggested she'd at least stayed through the night, rather than disappearing into early morning darkness. The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt interminable, Milo's hand sweating slightly in Leopold's grip, both of them caught between hope and fear in proportions that shifted moment to moment. Leopold knocked on room 1412 with more force than intended, his knuckles striking wood with authority that probably scared whoever was inside. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long, and he was raising his hand to knock again, when the door opened part-way, security chain still engaged, and Amber's face appeared in the gap. She looked simultaneously better and worse than the previous night, cleaner from having showered, but more haunted now that grime no longer obscured the full extent of her exhaustion, her eyes carrying the red-rimmed evidence of either crying or sleeplessness, or both. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come back," Amber said, her voice rough from disuse or emotion or both, her hand remaining on the door as if prepared to slam it shut if circumstances required rapid defense. "I kept thinking maybe the whole night was some kind of elaborate setup, that I'd wake up and find out it was a dream, or worse, that it was real, but the cost was something I couldn't afford to pay." The admission revealed how thoroughly her time on the streets had eroded her capacity to accept kindness without suspicion, how survival had required assuming that every offered hand concealed a hidden weapon. Leopold stepped back to create more physical and psychological space, his body language deliberately non-threatening in ways he'd learned from negotiating with people who had every reason to distrust him. "Dr. Chen will meet us at the clinic in 20 minutes, he said, keeping his tone neutral and factual rather than emotionally weighted. "She's a neurologist who specializes in trauma-related memory conditions, and she's bringing a team that includes psychological support, because this kind of amnesia typically involves more than just physical brain trauma." He paused, allowing her to process. "But none of that happens unless you choose to come. You can stay here another night or leave or whatever you decide." The chain disengaged with a metallic click, and the door opened fully, revealing Amber dressed in clothes that had clearly been delivered overnight. Simple jeans and a sweater that actually fit her diminished frame, rather than hanging in charitable folds. Her hair was clean, and pulled back into a ponytail that revealed the full extent of the scar at her temple, no longer hidden beneath strategic arrangements of dirty strands. She looked younger without the grime, but also more vulnerable, the protective layer of filth having served psychological function beyond just physical accumulation. Milo moved forward before Leopold could stop him, his small arms wrapping around Amber's waist in a hug that she clearly hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to receive. Her hands hovered uncertainly above the child's head for several seconds, before tentatively settling, the gesture awkward, but attempting something approximating maternal comfort. "You smell like the soap from my bathroom," Milo observed with the blunt honesty of childhood noticing details adults train themselves to overlook, the kind with lavender that helps you sleep better when you're worried about things. The observation made Amber's eyes fill with tears that she blinked back with visible effort, her throat working as she swallowed whatever emotion threatened to overwhelm carefully maintained composure. "I used half the bottle," she admitted quietly, her voice breaking slightly on the confession. "I stood in the shower until the water ran cold and then filled the bathtub and sat in it until it got cold too, because I couldn't remember the last time I'd been properly clean." The detail was almost unbearably intimate, revealing deprivation that went beyond simple poverty into sustained denial of basic human dignity. The drive to the private clinic took them through neighborhoods that transitioned from wealthy downtown to industrial district to wealthy again, the topography of Chicago's economic divisions laid bare in architecture and sidewalk maintenance. Milo maintained steady stream of observations from the back seat, his child's voice filling silences that might otherwise have become oppressive, asking questions about buildings and people that Amber attempted to answer, despite having no reliable knowledge about anything beyond immediate survival. Her responses carried the careful vagueness of someone improvising knowledge rather than drawing from memory, but the effort itself seemed to mean something to the boy. "Doctor." Chen waited in the clinic's private entrance, her professional appearance somehow managing to convey both competence and approachability, her manner suggesting she'd been briefed on the extreme sensitivity required for this consultation. Two other specialists flanked her, a man Leopold recognized as Dr. James Morton, trauma psychologist, and a younger woman whose ID badge identified her as Dr. Lisa Huang, cognitive assessment specialist. The assembled team represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in specialized expertise, all activated before 7 a.m. because Leopold had called and said the word emergency with appropriate gravitation in his voice. "Mrs. Varlotta," Dr. Chen said, extending her hand in greeting that acknowledged Amber's personhood, rather than just her status as interesting medical case. "I understand you've been experiencing complete autobiographical amnesia for approximately 3 years, following an incident that left you with visible head trauma." Her tone carried no judgment, just clinical assessment delivered with human warmth. "We'd like to start with comprehensive neurological evaluation, including imaging, followed by psychological assessment to understand the interplay between physical and trauma-induced memory loss." Amber shook the offered hand with visible hesitation, her eyes darting to Leopold, as if checking whether this was still something she was choosing, rather than something being done to her. "How long will all of this take?" she asked, the practical question revealing her discomfort with surrendering control for extended periods. "And what happens if you can't fix what's broken, if the memories are just gone permanently?" The second question carried more weight than the first, suggesting she'd already begun constructing expectations around permanent loss, rather than hoping for full restoration. "The physical evaluation will take about 3 hours, Dr. Chen explained, her voice patient in the way that suggested she was accustomed to anxious patients requiring detailed explanation before proceeding. "MRI imaging, cognitive function tests, neurological examination to map exactly what's happening in your brain when you try to access blocked memories." She gestured toward the interior of the clinic. "The psychological component can begin simultaneously, or wait until after we have the imaging results. Whatever feels less overwhelming for you to manage right now." Leopold watched Amber's face as she calculated variables he couldn't see, weighing factors that her experience on the streets had taught her to consider before trusting institutional systems. "I'll do it," she said finally, the decision clearly costing her something to articulate. Surrender of control never easy for someone who'd survived by trusting no one. "But I want Milo to stay nearby, not in the room necessarily, but somewhere I can see him if I need to remember why I'm doing this." The condition revealed that the child had become her anchor to present circumstances, the evidence that this wasn't just another hallucination or false promise that streets sometimes generated in desperate minds. Dr. Chen nodded understanding and led them into the clinic's interior, spaces designed more for comfort than medical efficiency, attempting to mitigate the institutional anxiety that traditional healthcare settings produced in patients already dealing with trauma. Milo settled into a waiting area visible through large glass windows, provided with tablet loaded with games and promise of regular check-ins. Amber's eyes kept returning to the child's location, even as she was guided into the examination room, her need for visual confirmation of his presence, suggesting separation anxiety, That made sense given how quickly he'd become the only stable point in her reconstructed reality. The MRI machine dominated the examination room like some kind of technological sarcophagus, its opening seeming to swallow patients whole before revealing whatever secrets their brains contained. Amber stared at it with undisguised apprehension, her body language suggesting flight response building toward critical mass. "I need you to lie still for about 40 minutes, Dr. Chen explained gently, her hand resting lightly on Amber's shoulder in gesture meant to ground rather than restrain. "The machine is loud, and the space is confined, but you'll be able to communicate with us the entire time if you start feeling panicked or need to stop." Amber slid into the MRI tube with visible reluctance, her body rigid with the kind of tension that suggested every instinct was screaming at her to flee. The machine hummed to life with mechanical sounds that filled the examination room, vibrations traveling through steel and into bone. Leopold watched through the observation window as technicians monitored screens displaying cross-sections of his wife's brain, the gray matter that contained all her stolen memories rendered into digital slices. Dr. Chen stood beside Leopold, studying the emerging images with the focused intensity of someone trained to detect abnormalities and patterns that looked identical to untrained eyes. Her finger traced a section of Amber's temporal lobe, where something appeared different from standard architecture, a subtle irregularity that might mean everything or nothing. "There's scarring here consistent with impact trauma," she said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry into the examination room. "But the interesting part is this area here, where activity patterns suggest active suppression rather than damage," Dr. Chen continued, tapping the screen where colors indicated neural activity. The distinction mattered in ways Leopold's non-medical brain struggled to fully process, but he understood enough to grasp that Amber's memories might not be destroyed. They were merely locked behind doors her psyche had barricaded for self-protection, which meant possibility existed for restoration if approached correctly without causing additional trauma. "Can you unlock them?" Leopold asked, the question emerging more bluntly than he'd intended, his desperation bleeding through professional composure. "Is there a way to restore access, or does trying to force the doors open risk destroying whatever's behind them?" The metaphor felt clumsy, but Dr. Chen nodded understanding, her expression suggesting she'd heard similar questions from other families desperate for miraculous solutions that medicine couldn't always provide. "The brain protects itself in remarkable ways," Dr. Chen explained, her tone carrying the careful balance between hope and realistic expectation that good doctors learn to maintain. "What we're seeing suggests that Amber experienced something so traumatic that her mind chose complete identity erasure over processing the memory." She pulled up additional imaging that showed activity patterns when patients attempted to recall blocked information. Forcing recovery could cause psychological breakdown, but gentle therapeutic approaches might allow her to choose when she's ready to remember. The 40 minutes stretched into something that felt geological. Each second weighted with the accumulated pressure of 3 years of searching and mourning suddenly compressed into present moment. Milo pressed his face against the observation window, his breath fogging the glass, as he watched his mother emerge from the machine. Amber's face was pale and streaked with tears. She'd cried silently during the scan, her hands trembling as a technician helped her sit up and regain equilibrium after extended stillness. Dr. Morton took over for the psychological assessment, leading Amber into a different room designed to feel more like a comfortable living space than clinical environment. Leather chairs faced each other across a low table, artwork on the walls carefully selected to be calming without being infantilizing. Leopold remained in the observation area with Milo, both of them watching through one-way glass, as the psychiatrist began asking questions designed to map the landscape of Amber's conscious awareness and the boundaries where memory abruptly terminated. "Tell me about your earliest clear memory, Doctor," Morton began, his voice gentle but professionally neutral, the tone of someone accustomed to navigating traumatized psyches. Amber's hands twisted in her lap as she searched for beginning points in a narrative that had no proper start, only the jarring awakening on a bus station bench. "I remember cold," she said finally, her voice barely audible even through the audio system. "Cold and confusion, and a woman's voice asking if I needed help. But when I tried to answer, I realized I didn't know my name." The recounting took nearly an hour, Amber describing the disorientation of constructing identity from nothing, the terror of realizing she couldn't access any information about who she'd been before that morning. She spoke about learning to navigate shelter systems, discovering which streets were safer for sleeping, understanding the invisible hierarchies among those who lived outside society's normal structures. Her voice remained remarkably steady, considering she was describing what amounted to 3 years of sustained trauma, the clinical detachment suggesting she'd learned to narrate her own suffering as if it belonged to someone else. Dr. Morton introduced photographs gradually, starting with neutral images of Chicago landmarks before moving to pictures that might trigger recognition. The Willis Tower produced nothing. Navy Pier elicited no response, but when he showed a picture of Lincoln Park's main entrance, Amber's breathing changed subtly. "I know that place," she said slowly, her eyes unfocusing as she reached for something just beyond conscious grasp. "I've been there, not recently but before, and there was someone small running ahead of me laughing." The fragment emerged and dissolved before she could capture it fully, leaving only frustration in its wake. "That's where we lived," Milo said from the observation room, his voice tight with excitement at this first crack in the wall separating his mother from her past. "Our house was 3 blocks from there, and we went to the park every Saturday morning when the weather was good." Leopold felt something loosen in his chest, the first genuine hope that restoration might be possible if approached with sufficient patience and care, that the woman who'd raised Milo for his first 4 years still existed somewhere behind the protective barriers trauma had constructed. The next photograph showed Amber and Leopold's wedding, and her physical response was immediate and undeniable, pupils dilating, breath catching, hand moving unconsciously to her chest as if warding off physical blow. "I can't," she said, her voice breaking into something between plea and command. "I can't look at that. It makes something hurt inside my head like pressing on a wound that hasn't healed." Dr. Morton immediately removed the image, his expression thoughtful as he made notes about which memories triggered protective responses versus which allowed tentative exploration. By the time the assessment concluded, they'd established a map of sorts. Geographic memories were more accessible than personal ones. Procedural knowledge remained intact, while autobiographical information was almost completely blocked, and anything connected to the night of her disappearance produced physical distress that bordered on panic. Dr. Morton's preliminary conclusion was that Amber had witnessed something so horrific that her mind had chosen to erase not just the specific memory, but her entire identity to avoid processing trauma that felt unsurvivable. "The good news is that suppressed memories can potentially be recovered," Dr. Morton explained during the consultation that followed, addressing both Leopold and Amber in the conference room, where Milo colored quietly in the corner. "The concerning news is that recovery needs to happen at Amber's pace, guided by her readiness, rather than external pressure." He looked directly at Leopold as he said this, making clear that pushing for rapid restoration would be counterproductive and possibly damaging. "What does that mean practically?" Leopold asked, his business mind wanting concrete timelines and measurable milestones, even as he understood that healing didn't follow project management principles. "What should we be doing day to day to support recovery without causing additional harm?" The question revealed how completely unprepared he was for the role of caregiver to someone who existed in this strange liminal space between stranger and intimate family member. Dr. Morton pulled out a folder containing detailed recommendations, therapeutic exercises designed to gently probe memory barriers without triggering defensive responses. "Amber needs stability first. Consistent housing, regular meals, safety that doesn't require constant vigilance," he said, ticking off fundamentals that seemed obvious, but which had been absent from her life for 3 years. "Once basic needs are met consistently enough that her nervous system can begin to relax, we can introduce memory work through graduated exposure to familiar environments and relationships." "How long?" Amber asked, her voice small, in a way that revealed how overwhelmed she felt by the complexity of what lay ahead. "How long until I know who I was, or if that person even still exists to be recovered?" The question contained an ocean of fear about discovering that the woman in the photographs had been completely erased, that whatever identity she'd constructed from nothing over 3 years was all that remained and would need to be enough. "There's no standard timeline," Dr. Morton said honestly, refusing to offer false comfort that would only lead to disappointment when arbitrary deadlines passed without breakthrough. "Some patients recover significant memories within weeks, others take years, and some never fully restore what was lost but build new memories that eventually matter more than the old ones." He leaned forward slightly, his expression compassionate. "The goal isn't to erase who you've become or force you back into being who you were. It's to give you access to your full story so you can choose how to move forward." The question of where Amber would live while pursuing treatment hung unspoken in the air until Leopold finally addressed it with the directness that characterized his professional negotiations. "The hotel isn't sustainable long-term," he said, keeping his voice carefully neutral, to avoid pressuring her toward any particular conclusion. "You need space that feels like yours rather than borrowed, somewhere stable enough that your nervous system can stop operating in constant survival mode." He paused, measuring his next words carefully. "Our house has guest quarters that are completely separate from the main living areas." Amber's face reflected the internal calculation she was performing, weighing the practicality of the offer against the psychological complexity of living in a house she didn't remember sharing with a man she didn't recall marrying. "Separate entrance?" she asked, the question revealing which specific concerns were driving her hesitation about accepting what was objectively the most sensible arrangement. "Separate bathroom and kitchen access so I'm not dependent on you for basic functions or forced into proximity when I need space." The condition spoke to hard-won knowledge about how power imbalances functioned in domestic situations. "Completely separate," Leopold confirmed, already mentally reviewing the guest house configuration to ensure it would meet her requirements without modification. "It was originally designed for live-in staff, but we converted it when Milo was born, kept it as space for visiting family." The history made Amber's eyes flicker with something that might have been recognition, or might have been imagination filling gaps with plausible scenarios. "Your sister stayed there when she visited, before everything happened, and she said it felt like having her own apartment." The mention of Catherine produced the same physical response as before, Amber's hand moving to her chest as if responding to internal pressure that names without attached memories created. "Can I see it before deciding?" she asked, the request reasonable, and Leopold nodded immediate agreement, recognizing that someone who'd survived through constant vigilance wouldn't agree to any living situation without first verifying exit routes and assessing potential vulnerabilities. They left the clinic with Milo walking between them, the child's hand clasped in Amber's with a possessiveness that suggested he feared she might vanish if his grip loosened. The drive back to Lincoln Park felt different than the morning journey, weighted with the day's revelations and the tentative steps toward reconstruction that felt more real than Leopold had dared hope. Milo narrated the passing streets with the enthusiasm of a tour guide who'd been waiting years for this specific audience, pointing out places that held significance he desperately wanted his mother to share. "That's where we got ice cream every Friday after your piano lessons," he said, indicating a shop that had changed ownership twice since Amber's disappearance, but which occupied the same corner. Piano lessons registered something in Amber's expression, a flicker of connection to information that felt true, even without supporting memories to confirm it. "I play piano?" she asked, the question directed more at herself than at Milo, her fingers moving unconsciously in patterns that suggested muscle memory responding to verbal cue. "That feels right somehow, like my hands know something my brain doesn't about where they're supposed to be and what movements they're supposed to make." The observation aligned with Dr. Morton's assessment that procedural memories often survived when autobiographical ones were suppressed. The house appeared gradually through bare winter trees, a brownstone that spoke of old money maintained through generations, rather than newly acquired wealth. Amber stared at the facade with an expression that cycled through emotions too complex to name, searching for recognition that remained stubbornly absent, despite the building's obvious significance. "I lived here," she said slowly, the statement positioned somewhere between question and attempt to make abstract knowledge feel concrete. "This was home. These walls contained my life, and now it's just architecture that means nothing except what people tell me it should mean." Leopold led her around to the side entrance that accessed the guest house, a path that avoided walking through the main residence where accumulated memories pressed against every surface. The guest quarters exceeded what he'd described. A full studio apartment with bedroom alcove, functional kitchen, bathroom with deep tub, and living area that managed to feel spacious despite modest dimensions. Windows overlooked a small private garden that would be beautiful in spring, but currently held only dormant plants and accumulated snow. "The piano is in the main house," Leopold said, watching Amber's face for reaction to this information. "It's still tuned. I couldn't bring myself to let it fall into disrepair even after you were gone." The admission revealed more than he'd intended about his own inability to fully accept her death, the ways he'd preserved pieces of her existence like museum exhibits dedicated to a life interrupted. "You're welcome to use it whenever you want. The door between the houses is never locked." Amber moved through the space, touching surfaces tentatively, opening cabinets to verify they contained basic supplies, testing the water pressure in the sink with the methodical thoroughness of someone accustomed to identifying a space's limitations before committing to it. "I'll stay," she said finally, the decision emerging after several minutes of silent evaluation. But I'm paying rent, even if it's just nominal amount, because accepting this much without contributing anything makes me feel like I'm accumulating debt I can't repay. The insistence on maintaining some form of financial independence, however symbolic, revealed pride that poverty hadn't managed to erase. Whatever makes you comfortable, Leopold agreed, recognizing that arguing the point would be counterproductive, even though the idea of charging his own wife rent felt absurd. They could negotiate the details later once she'd settled enough to think beyond immediate survival concerns. Milo had already claimed the window seat, his small body curled into the cushions, as if staking territorial claim to space he intended to occupy frequently, regardless of his mother's preference for solitude. The actual move from hotel to guest house took less than an hour, because Amber owned essentially nothing beyond the clothes Leopold had arranged to be purchased, and the canvas bag containing her accumulated treasures. Each object from the bag was removed and placed with care that suggested these items represented something more valuable than their material worth: the smooth stones arranged on the windowsill, the buttons displayed in a small dish, the photograph given place of honor on the nightstand. The arrangement transformed the anonymous space into something more personal, evidence of identity asserting itself even without memory to support it. There's a support group that meets Tuesday evenings at the community center, Dr. Chen had mentioned during their departure from the clinic, handing Amber a flyer that listed resources for people dealing with memory loss and trauma. It's not therapy exactly, just people who understand what it's like to have pieces of themselves missing, comparing strategies for building life when you can't remember the foundation. Amber had tucked the flyer into her pocket without committing to attendance, but Leopold noticed her pulling it out later to study the details with obvious interest. That first evening in the guest house passed with careful choreography, Leopold and Milo providing proximity without pressure, offering presence without demanding interaction. They ate dinner together in the main house's kitchen, simple pasta that Leopold managed not to ruin. Milo chattering about school and friends in a monologue that required no response beyond occasional nods. Amber sat at the table where she'd presumably sat hundreds of times before, her fingers tracing the wood grain, as if searching for grooves that might trigger recognition through texture rather than sight. After dinner, Milo asked if his mother would read him a bedtime story, the request delivered with a casualness that belied its significance. Amber's eyes widened with something between panic and desire, the prospect of performing such an intimate maternal act toward a child she didn't remember bearing clearly overwhelming. "I don't know if I'll do it right," she said, her voice carrying the vulnerability of someone being asked to perform without a script, in a language she'd forgotten. "What if I mess it up or it feels wrong to you?" "You can't mess it up," Milo said, with the confident assurance of someone who'd waited 3 years for exactly this moment and wasn't about to let self-doubt prevent it. "You just read the words and do the voices, and if you forget how you used to do it, then you can make up new ways and that'll be fine too." The child's capacity for accepting imperfect restoration rather than demanding impossible perfection struck Leopold as remarkably mature for someone so young, evidence of how thoroughly loss had shaped Milo's development and expectations. They settled on the couch in the main house, Milo pressed against Amber's side while she held a picture book at an angle that allowed them both to see. Her voice started uncertain, stumbling over simple words as if she'd forgotten how reading aloud worked, but gradually smoothed into a rhythm that felt natural. When she attempted a voice for the dragon character, using a comically deep tone, Milo's delighted laughter filled the room with sound it hadn't held in years. "That's not how you used to do it," the boy said between giggles, "but I like this way better, actually." The reading concluded, and Milo's eyes were already drooping, his small body relaxed against his mother's arm in the specific way that preceded sleep. Amber looked down at him with an expression that contained more tenderness than recognition, the instinctive response of holding a sleeping child regardless of whether memory connected them. "Thank you for letting me try this," she said quietly to Leopold, who stood in the doorway observing. "Even if I can't remember being his mother, something in me wants to learn how to do it again." Leopold carried the sleeping Milo to his bed, tucking him in with practiced movements while Amber watched from the doorway. The boy's room was a shrine to unchanged childhood, toys and books exactly where they'd been the night his mother disappeared, because Leopold hadn't possessed the emotional bandwidth to modify anything. "He talks to your picture every night before sleep," Leopold said softly, indicating the framed photograph on the nightstand. "Tells you about his day like you're just away on a trip rather than gone. Like maybe if he maintains the routine long enough, you'll hear him somehow and find your way home." Amber's eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide, her hand covering her mouth as if physically restraining emotion that threatened to overflow. "He shouldn't have had to do that," she whispered, the guilt in her voice suggesting she held herself responsible despite having no control over circumstances that had stolen her away. He should have had a mother who was present, not a ghost he had to maintain relationship with through one-sided conversations and desperate hope. The self-recrimination revealed how thoroughly she'd internalized blame for situations that predated her ability to influence outcomes. "You're here now," Leopold said simply, the statement offering absolution she clearly needed, even if she couldn't yet accept it fully. "That's what matters. Not the time that was lost, but the possibility of time ahead." The words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what they faced, but language had never been sufficient for naming the specific shapes that love and loss created when they collided and somehow had to coexist. The following weeks developed a rhythm that felt both strange and increasingly natural, a new normal constructed from fragments of old life and necessities of current circumstances. Amber attended therapy twice weekly with Dr. Morton, sessions that gradually chipped away at the walls, protecting her from memories she wasn't ready to process. Between sessions, she explored the neighborhood with tentative steps, relearning geography that her feet seemed to remember even when her mind drew blanks about why certain corners felt significant. The piano became an unexpected bridge between who she'd been and who she was becoming, her fingers finding keys with the certainty of muscles that had logged thousands of hours of practice. She couldn't remember learning to play or the pieces she'd mastered, but when she sat at the instrument and allowed her hands to move without conscious direction, music emerged that carried emotional weight her amnesia couldn't completely suppress. Mozart sonatas flowed from memory that wasn't quite memory, Chopin nocturnes that made her cry without understanding why the melodies felt like grief given audible form. Milo adopted the habit of doing homework at the table in Amber's guest house, his presence becoming such a fixture that she stopped questioning whether he should be spending so much time with a mother who didn't remember him. The boy's patient acceptance of her limitations somehow made space for connection that didn't require shared history, relationship built on present moments, rather than accumulated past. They developed new rituals, afternoon walks where Milo narrated neighborhood history, evening cooking experiments where Amber's muscle memory revealed she knew techniques she couldn't recall learning. The physical act of cooking together revealed patterns that transcended conscious memory, Amber's hands reaching for spices in combinations that produced familiar flavors, without her understanding why certain ingredients belonged together. She discovered she could make pasta carbonara from muscle memory alone, her fingers moving through the steps with practiced efficiency, while her mind drew complete blanks about where she'd learned the technique or how many times she'd prepared this exact dish. Milo watched these moments with fascination, witnessing his mother's body remember what her brain had forgotten. The strange disconnect between knowledge stored in neural pathways versus knowledge requiring conscious access to retrieve and deploy. Leopold found himself rearranging his schedule to be present for these domestic moments, something he'd rarely prioritized during their previous life together, when business demands had seemed more urgent than family dinners. The transformation wasn't entirely voluntary. Guilt drove much of it. The crushing awareness that he'd walked past his wife suffering on the street, and would have continued walking if Milo hadn't possessed better recognition skills than his father. That near miss haunted Leopold's dreams, variations where they walked past and never discovered the truth, where Amber remained invisible among the city's discarded population, while he attended galas and wrote checks to assuage conscience that didn't know it needed assuaging for more personal failures. Amber began venturing into the main house more frequently as weeks progressed, her initial territorial boundaries around the guest quarters relaxing, as familiarity bred comfort rather than contempt. She'd appear in the kitchen during breakfast preparation, offering to help with tasks that her hands knew how to perform, even when her mind couldn't explain the knowledge. The photographs throughout the house no longer triggered the sharp defensive pain they'd initially produced, instead, evoking something closer to curiosity about the smiling woman who wore her face, but seemed to belong to different reality entirely. Someone whose happiness felt simultaneously authentic and completely foreign. The neighborhood gradually revealed itself as a palimpsest of forgotten experiences, each street corner potentially holding memories that might surface if conditions aligned correctly. Amber walked the same routes repeatedly, hoping that repetition would trigger recognition, that her feet might remember paths her mind had erased. Sometimes shop owners would recognize her and express shock at seeing her alive, their reactions confirming that she'd existed in this community, that her absence had been noted even if not actively mourned by people who'd only known her as pleasant customer or passing neighbor, rather than intimate friend. Doctor. Morton suggested journaling as a method for tracking which experiences triggered fragment recovery versus which areas remained completely inaccessible despite repeated exposure. Amber filled notebooks with observations about what felt familiar versus what remained stubbornly foreign, creating maps of her own consciousness that revealed patterns about what her psyche was protecting versus what it allowed her to access. The entries became increasingly introspective as she gained confidence with the practice, evolving from simple factual documentation into deeper exploration of who she was becoming in the space between who she'd been and who she might have been if trauma hadn't intervened and rewritten her trajectory entirely. The Tuesday evening support group became a lifeline Amber hadn't known she needed, a room full of people who understood the specific disorientation of missing pieces of themselves. She returned from the first meeting more animated than Leopold had seen her, talking about a woman who'd lost 10 years to a brain injury and a man who'd woken from a coma with no memory of his previous life. "They're building new lives instead of trying to resurrect old ones," she said, her voice carrying something that sounded almost like hope. "Maybe that's what I need to do too, instead of beating myself up for not remembering." Catherine arrived from Milwaukee on a cold Thursday in February, the sister whose existence Amber knew about intellectually but couldn't access emotionally. The reunion was complicated and tearful, Catherine alternating between joy at finding her sister alive and grief at being forgotten by someone who'd been her closest confidant for 30 years. "You used to call me every Sunday morning," Catherine said through tears, clutching Amber's hands across the coffee table. "We'd talk for hours about nothing important, and I kept calling your number for months after you disappeared just to hear your voicemail greeting." The detail produced a physical reaction in Amber, a sharp pain behind her eyes that signaled her mind approaching something it wasn't ready to access, and she had to ask Catherine to stop sharing specific memories that triggered protective responses. They settled instead into getting to know each other as new people, Catherine sharing current life details while carefully avoiding references to shared past. The twins came with her, 6-year-olds who stared at their aunt with the brutal curiosity of children who'd been told she was dead and now had to reconcile resurrection with their understanding of permanence. Leopold's business required attention he'd been neglecting during the crisis of Amber's rediscovery, obligations and relationships that didn't pause simply because his personal life had exploded into chaos. He returned to regular schedule gradually, discovering that Amber seemed more comfortable with space between them, that proximity without pressure allowed something like friendship to develop that might eventually support more complex connection. They fell into patterns of brief morning conversations over coffee and longer evening discussions after Milo slept, talking about nothing consequential, but establishing comfort with shared silence. The breakthrough came 3 months after that initial night on the Winter Street, during a thunderstorm that rattled windows and made Amber's guest house feel small and insufficient. Leopold found her on the main house's back porch at 2 a.m., standing in the rain with her face tilted toward the sky as water streamed over her. "I remembered something," she said when she noticed him, her voice carrying the wonder of someone who'd stopped believing recovery was possible. "Not everything, just a fragment. But it was real memory, not reconstruction from photographs or other people's stories." She described the image that had surfaced, sitting in this same spot during a different storm, heavily pregnant and unable to sleep, Leopold bringing her tea and sitting beside her while they watched lightning illuminate the garden. The memory was incomplete, lacking context about when or why, but its authenticity was undeniable in the way her body responded to recollection rather than reported information. "You were worried about being a good father," she said, her eyes distant as she accessed the fragment carefully. "And I told you that worry itself meant you'd be fine because people who don't care don't question their adequacy." The recovered memory opened something in Leopold that he'd kept carefully sealed, permission to hope that restoration might be possible in ways he'd trained himself not to expect. He'd been operating under the assumption that Amber would remain permanently fractured, that the best they could achieve was comfortable coexistence between strangers who shared legal ties and a child. But this fragment suggested that with time and patience, enough pieces might resurface to reconstruct something approximating the relationship they'd lost, even if the reconstruction would inevitably differ from the original in ways both subtle and profound. Amber began requesting stories about their courtship, asking Leopold to fill in the narrative gaps that photographs couldn't adequately convey. He described their first meeting at a gallery opening where she'd been displaying her own artwork, small watercolors that captured Chicago architecture with a melancholic beauty that had arrested his attention more effectively than the featured exhibition. She'd been unimpressed by his initial attempts at conversation, seeing through the surface charm to the calculated nature of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through strategic deployment of charisma, rather than genuine vulnerability. "You made me work for every conversation," Leopold said, the memory bringing a smile that felt rusty from disuse, his face having forgotten how to arrange itself around uncomplicated happiness. "You'd answer my questions but never ask any back, forcing me to either keep talking or accept that you weren't interested in knowing me beyond surface pleasantries." The challenge had intrigued him precisely because it was so unusual, his world populated by people who competed for his attention rather than requiring him to earn theirs, the novelty of genuine disinterest proving more seductive than any calculated flirtation could have been. The courtship stories revealed a version of Leopold that Amber struggled to reconcile with the man she knew now, someone who'd apparently been willing to be vulnerable in ways his current guarded demeanor rarely permitted. He described elaborate gestures designed to demonstrate seriousness of intent, private concerts featuring her favorite pianist, weekend trips to cities whose architecture she'd admired from photographs, eventually the patient dismantling of her entirely justified skepticism about whether someone in his line of work could sustain the kind of partnership she required to feel safe enough to commit. "What changed?" Amber asked, trying to understand how the persistent suitor became the man who'd let her walk away angry into a night that swallowed her whole. What happened between those grand romantic gestures and the argument that ended with me leaving, between the version who worked so hard to win me and the version who assumed I'd come back without needing to be pursued? Mo. The question cut deeper than she'd perhaps intended, exposing the wound at the center of their current complicated dynamic. The awareness that if he'd followed her that night, instead of letting pride dictate strategy, 3 years of suffering might have been prevented. The moment marked a turning point, proof that memories weren't destroyed but merely locked away, that patience and safety might gradually restore access to what trauma had hidden. Additional fragments surfaced over the following weeks, flashes of Milo as an infant, snippets of conversations whose participants she couldn't identify, sensory memories of textures and scents that seemed significant without explanation. Dr. Morton called it spontaneous recovery, accelerated by environmental cues and emotional safety, the clinical terminology failing to capture the profound relief of discovering that who she'd been wasn't completely erased. By spring, Amber had recovered enough fragments to construct a skeletal outline of her previous life, though massive gaps remained particularly around the night of her disappearance. She'd stopped trying to force memory and instead focused on building present existence that incorporated both recovered pieces and the person she'd become during her years on the streets. The combination created someone new, neither the woman she'd been, nor the terrified beggar Leopold had almost ignored, but a third version that integrated both experiences into something more complex and resilient than either alone. The question of romantic reconnection remained unresolved, a tension that existed between them, but which neither pushed toward conclusion. Amber had memories of loving Leopold, but couldn't access the actual feeling, while Leopold loved both the woman she'd been and was becoming, but didn't know how to navigate relationship with someone who was simultaneously familiar and stranger. They existed in comfortable limbo, co-parenting Milo and sharing space while leaving undefined the question of whether they remained married in any meaningful sense beyond legal technicality. Milo seemed content with the arrangement, his mother's presence in whatever capacity she could offer apparently sufficient to heal wounds that 3 years of absence had created. The boy had stopped asking when she'd remember everything, and started instead building new memories that would eventually matter more than recovered old ones. They had inside jokes now, shared experiences that belonged to this version of their relationship, the foundation for future that didn't require past to validate its existence. The investigation into what happened the night Amber disappeared remained active, Leopold's resources devoted to uncovering truth that might explain but could never excuse the 3 years of suffering that followed. Security footage from the relevant time period had been reviewed, witnesses interviewed, every lead pursued with the obsessive thoroughness of someone who needed answers, even if they came too late to prevent damage. The truth, when it finally emerged, was simultaneously mundane and devastating. Wrong place, wrong time, a robbery gone violent that had left Amber with head trauma, and no one had witnessed or reported. The perpetrators had been caught months after the incident for unrelated crimes. Their confession to attacking a woman near the Harrison Street terminal, given without knowing her identity, or caring about what happened after they'd left her bleeding on the pavement. The randomness of it, the absolute lack of meaning beyond simple criminal opportunism, made the loss somehow harder to accept than if there had been intentional malice from Leopold's enemies. She'd been stolen from her life for pocket money, and a purse they'd thrown away when it contained nothing valuable. The cost-benefit analysis of street crime rendered inhuman suffering that couldn't be adequately compensated even by the justice system's maximum penalties. But revenge and justice, while pursued, couldn't restore what had been lost or fast forward through the slow work of recovery that occupied their days. Amber continued therapy, continued building relationship with her son, continued the patient reconstruction of identity that incorporated both who she'd been and who she'd become. Some days were harder than others, memories surfacing that brought pain or confusion, but the trajectory overall moved toward integration rather than fragmentation, toward future rather than remain trapped by past. On a warm evening in late May, Amber played piano while Milo dozed on the couch and Leopold worked on his laptop nearby, the domestic scene unremarkable except for how remarkable it would have seemed 6 months earlier. She finished the piece she'd been practicing and sat with her hands resting on the keys, her eyes closed as she held the final notes in her mind. "I'm happy," she said quietly, surprising herself with the observation. "I don't remember most of my life. I still have nightmares about sleeping in subway stations. But right now in this moment I'm actually happy." The declaration felt like victory in a war that had never had clear battle lines or measurable objectives, triumph that looked nothing like what Leopold had imagined when he first recognized the beggar as his wife. They weren't the family they'd been before, couldn't return to innocent assumptions about safety and stability that trauma had permanently destroyed. But they were something new, something built on honesty about fragility and impermanence, on acceptance that memory was only one form of connection, and present attention could matter as much as shared history. Thank you all for following this story. If you've connected with Amber, Leopold, and Milo's journey, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you stories about second chances, the resilience of the human spirit, and families finding their way back to each other even when the path forward looks nothing like the one they lost.